Yesterday, I tried to make clear the state of tension or even of conflict which naturally exists between art and morality, and which proceeds from the basic fact that art is intent on the good of the work, not on the good of man, whereas morality is intent on the good of man, not on the good of the work. Of this opposition between the good or perfection of the work and the good of man or the perfection of human life, the artists are clearly aware. Let us read this poem of Yeats, entitled The Choice. I suppose Yeats had some idea of Thomistic philosophy, more or less distorted or exaggerated. The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work, and if it takes the second, must refuse a heavenly mansion raging in the dark. When all that story is finished, what's the news? In luck or out, the toil has left its mark, that old perplexity, an empty purse, or the day's vanity, the night's remorse. Today, it is of a vicious conception, a misuse and misinterpretation of the truths I emphasized concerning art, or of the fact that art of itself tends only to the good of the work, that I should like to speak. In other words, I shall discuss the motto "Art for art's sake," a motto which in the last analysis originates in a hypostasierung, a substantification or hypostasation of art, or a confusion between art taken in itself and separately, which exists only in our mind, and art as it really exists, that is, as a virtue of man. In other words, a confusion between the artist abstractly cut off from man and man the artist. The motto "Art for art's sake" simply disregards the world of morality and the values and rights of human life. Art for art's sake does not mean art for the work, which is the right formula. It means an absurdity, that is, a supposed necessity for the artist to be only, merely an artist, not a man, and for art to cut itself off from its own supplies and from all the food, fuel, and energy it receives from human life. To tell the truth, art took to enclosing itself in its famous ivory tower in the 19th century only because of the disheartening degradation of its environment, positivist, sociologist, or materialist intelligence. But the normal condition of art is altogether different. Aeschylus, Dante, Cervantes, Shakespeare, or Dostoevsky did not write in a vacuum bell. They had large human purposes. They did not write assuming that it did not matter what they wrote. Well, did not Dante believe he was only giving a higher course in catechism and turning his readers toward the business of their eternal salvation? Did not Lucretius indeed intend to spread the Epicurean system? Virgil, when he composed the Georgics, to bring manpower back to the land, or Wagner to glorify the Teutonic religion. For all that, they did not go in for propaganda art. Even Wagner, though with Wagner I am not so sure. But the fact that Frenchmen of my generation consider Wagner a great corrupter of music, an abortive magician, is beside the point. What I mean is that with all genuine great artists and poets, the richer was the human stuff, the more strongly everything was mastered for the good of the work and subordinated to the inner self-sufficiency of this self-subsisting cosmos. For, as I said a moment ago, art is not an abstract entity without flesh and bones, a separate Platonic idea supposedly come down on earth and acting among us as the angel of the making, or as a metaphysical dragon let loose. Art is a virtue of the practical intellect, and the intellect itself does not stand alone, but is a power of man. Art is a virtue of man. When the intellect thinks, it is not the intellect which thinks, it is man, a particular man, who thinks through his intellect. When art operates, it is not art which operates, it is man, a particular man, who operates through his art. In the very line of the artistic production or creation, that which exists and what we have to consider, that which is the agent, is man the artist. It is nonsense to believe that the genuineness or the purity of the work of art depends upon a rupture with, a moving away from the living forces which animate and move the human being. It is nonsense to believe that this purity of the work depends on a wall of separation built up between art and desire or love. The purity of the work depends upon the strength of the inner dynamism which generates the work. That is, the strength of the virtue of art. There was a tree which said, I want to be tree and nothing but a tree, and to bear fruit which shall be my pure fruit. Therefore, I refuse to grow in a soil which is not itself a tree, or in a climate which is climate of Vermont or Scotland or Touraine, in which is not my own unique climate. And I refuse to have my fruit either receive anything from the sun or tend to perpetuate the race. I want them to be purely my own fruit, depending only on myself and empty of any seed. Shelter me from the air. No wall of separation isolates the virtue of art from the inner universe of man's desire and love. There exists, to be sure, a special desire and love which is simply one with the activity of the artist, consubstantial with this activity. That is the desire and love to create a work. Discussing a book by Henry Bremont, my first qualm, T.S. Eliot said, is over the assertion that, quote from Bremont, the more of a poet any particular poet is, the more he is tormented by the need of communicating his experience. That's a sentence by Bremont. And Eliot goes on to say, this is a downright sort of statement which is very easy to accept without examination. But the matter is not so simple as all that. I should say that the poet is tormented primarily by the need to write a poem, unquote. Yet, Eliot's accurate remark must not mislead us in the very urge toward the work and toward creation. The desire is involved not precisely to communicate our experience to another, but to express, to manifest it. For what is creation, if not an expression of the Creator? Man's substance is unknown to itself, to himself. It is when he grasps things through emotion that for the poet things and the self are awakened together in a particular kind of knowledge, obscure, ineffable in itself, which can be expressed only in a work, and which is poetic knowledge. At this point, we are confronted with the essential part played by subjectivity, by the self, in poetic knowledge and poetic activity. An Oriental critic, in his book on the truth of decorative art, a dialogue between an Oriental and an Occidental, Mr. Lionel de Fonseca, has written that vulgarity always says I. Well, vulgarity says one also, and this is the same thing. For vulgarity's I is nothing but a neuter subject of predicates or of phenomena, a subject as matter, marked with the opacity and voracity of matter, like the I of the egoist. But in an entirely different manner, poetry likewise always says I. Listen to the Psalms. My heart hath uttered a good word. Vivify me, and I will keep thy commandments, and so forth. Poetry's I is the substantial depth of the living and loving subjectivity. It is a subject as act, marked with the diaphaneity and expansiveness proper to the operations of the spirit. Poetry's I resembles in this regard to the eye of the saint, and likewise, although in another fashion, it is a subject which gives. The art of China and of India, like that of the Middle Ages, shelters itself in vain behind the right or the simple duty of ornamenting life. It is as personal as that of the individualistic Occident. The more or less rigorous canonicity of art is here a secondary condition. In the days of old, it was a condition favorable for hiding art from itself. But the consciousness of itself, and at the same time, the freedom which art acquired a taste for, are fine dangers which mobilized poetry. Well, my contention is that by necessity, as a corollary of the preceding observations on the nature of poetic knowledge, which is at the core of poetic activity, poetic activity is of itself essentially disinterested. It engages the human self in its deepest recesses, but in no way for the sake of the human ego, of the self-centered ego. The very engagement of the artist's self in poetic activity, the very revelation of the artist's self in his work, together with the revelation of the particular secret he has obscurely grasped in things, are for the sake of the work. The self is both revealing itself and sacrificing itself, because it is given, it is drawn out of itself in that sort of ecstasy which is creation. It dies to itself in order to live in the work, and how humbly and defenselessly. Now, what does this essential disinterestedness of poetic activity mean? It means that egoism is the natural enemy of poetic activity. The artist as a man can be busy only with his desire and love for creation. He can say, like Baudelaire, I don't give a damn for the human race. He can be concerned only with his work, like Proust. He can be an out-and-out egoist, as Goethe was. In his process of creation, inasmuch as he is an artist, he is not an egoist. He is disinterested in the ego. And obviously the artist can also have his desire and love for creation involved in the movement of expansion and generosity of a soul whose passions and ambitions are not of an egoist. And such internal abundance and magnanimity is even the normal and connatural climate of the virtue of art, of the virtue of the poet. Narrowness and avarice in human desires make it live in cold and hell. After all, Shelley was right in writing that the state of mind naturally linked with poetic inspiration, quote, is at war with every base desire, unquote. Though he went perhaps a little too far when he added, quote, a poet as he is the author to others of the highest wisdom, pleasure, virtue, and glory, so he ought personally to be the happiest, the best, the wisest, and the most illustrious of men. Unquote. The artists of the Renaissance were not as men models of wisdom, disinterestedness, and benevolence, but at least they were also interested in great causes and ideas. They had great human aspirations, and even their pride and their vices throve on a generous blood. Let us observe in addition that many elements in the work itself can convey the resentment or maliciousness of its author. A rhythm, a musical motive, a brush stroke, a color can be malicious. But the melody in the work, sonat, picture, or poem, cannot be malicious. The melody, as Arthur Laurier put it, is always good. La mélodie est toujours bonne. Because the melody is the most immediate vehicle of the poetic sense. And he went on to say, it is perhaps because we have become wicked that we have lost or claim to have lost the melody. Unquote. It is, I think, that, parenthesis, it is, I think, by reason of the essential disinterestedness which I just pointed out of the poet in the very act of poetry, and by reason of his natural orientation toward creation, that the poets and artists of the past gave us so poor indications on their own inner creative experience. They spoke in the most conventional and shallow rhetoric and the most commonplace stock phrases, nascentur poetae, the muses, the genius, the poetic faculty, the divine spark, later on the goddess imagination, of this experience, which at least the greatest among them lived in fact, no doubt, but which their conscious intellect did not seek to grasp. They were not interested in reflexive self-awareness. The reflex age, the age of prise de conscience, which, roughly speaking, started for mysticism at the time of Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, came later for poetry. When it started for it at the time of Romanticism, it brought to completion the slow process of revelation of the self which had progressively developed in the course of modern centuries. This revelation of the creative self is a blessing, inasmuch as it takes place in the genuine line of poetry. But it becomes a curse when it shifts from the line of poetry and of the self in the fire of spiritual communication to the line of man's material individuality and of the self as jealous proprietor and as center of insatiable lusts. Then the egoism of man enters the very sphere of the poetic act, not only to spoil it, but to feed on it. On the one hand, such growth of the human egoism, being unnatural, becomes boundless. On the other hand, as regards the creative act, the artist no longer manifests himself and the world in his work, but he unloads himself in it and pours his own complexes and poisons into it and into the reader, thus achieving a psychological cure at the expense of both. The accident came about, it is sad to say, simultaneously with the most glorious discoveries achieved by the self-awareness of poetry as poetry. And nevertheless, this is the point I should like to make, the essential disinterestedness of the poetic act is so ineradicable that the final result of this invasion of the human ego in the universe of art was not, in actual fact, to make the artist into a creative usurer. That's a contradiction in terms. But as we shall see at the end of this talk, to make him into a hero, a priest, or a savior, offering himself in sacrifice no longer to his work, but both to mankind and his own glory. Let us come back now to the discussion of art for art's sake. The previous considerations help us to realize that from the point of view of ends or of final causality, it is but normal that all the desires and loves with which human life is filled should be at play in the soul of the artist. They tend toward ends which are not the proper ends of art, but they feed and nourish art and poetry. And they will not warp the work, they will enrich it, if only art and poetry themselves tend purely and unyieldingly to their own ends in the making of the work. No doubt I know that when it comes to a particular human purpose for which the work is done, propaganda plays, patriotic poems, and moralizing literature are not up to much as a rule. But it is so because, as a rule, the artist has allowed his moral idea to enter the very sphere of the making and act as a way of making, which it is not. I also know that the cathedral builders had no sort of thesis in mind, nor did they want to suggest a Christian emotion. But they had the faith, and it was enough. The human ends with which I am concerned here are not particular purposes, but rather the things in which the artist believes and which he loves. In this sense, it is but normal that a poet or a writer, a man who works with words, should have a message, not only his proper artistic message, which is the essential, but also a human message of his own, silly, foolish, or momentous, to deliver to men. Otherwise, there would be a serious risk that his work would have nothing to say. Such was, I dare say, the fate of Mallarmé's Narcissus. I spoke at the beginning of Dante, Virgil, and Lucretius. I might speak of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, of Walt Whitman, of William Blake, of Léon Blois, of Nietzsche. There is nothing to stop André Gide from saying it does not matter what one writes. But in reality, he himself was constantly prodded by a kind of apostolic zeal, rather particular in nature. That's another question. The chief intent of which was to justify himself in the eyes of men. The workman works for his wages, and the most disincarnate artist has a concern concealed or repressed as it may be, to act upon human souls and to serve an idea. What is required is the perfect practical discrimination between the aim of the workman, finis operantis, as the schoolman put it, and the aim of the work, finis operis, so that the workman should work for his wages, but the work be ruled and shaped and brought into being only with regard to its own good and nowise with regard to the wages. Thus, the artist may work for any and every human intention he likes, but the work taken in itself must be made and constructed only with regard to the creative intuition in which it originates and to the rules of making which it calls for. Similar considerations may be put forward from the point of view of an end which is not simply the perfection of the work to be achieved, and which is of an order superior to art, the communication of divine goodness. Finally, our issue has also to do with the perspective of material causality. It would simplify many questions to make a distinction between art itself and its material or subjective conditions. Art being of man, how could it not depend on the pre-existing structures and inclinations of the subject in which it dwells? They remain extrinsic to art, but they influence it necessarily. Art as such, for instance, transcends, like the mind, every frontier of space or time, every historical or national boundary. Like science and philosophy, it is universal of itself. But art does not reside in an angelic mind. It resides in a soul which animates a living body, and which, by the natural necessity in which it finds itself of learning and progressing little by little, and with the assistance of others, makes the rational animal a naturally social animal. Art is therefore basically dependent upon everything which the human community, spiritual tradition, and history transmit to the body and mind of man by its human subject and its human roots. Art belongs to a time and to a country. The second part of this lecture will deal with the artist in relation to the community. In other words, with the problem of the moral responsibility of the artist with regard to men. All that we have seen shows that this responsibility exists, since morality is not a branch of aesthetics. The problem cannot be avoided. Every work of art reaches man in his inner powers. It reaches him more profoundly and insidiously than any rational proposition, either cogent demonstration or sophistry. For it strikes him with two terrible weapons: inspiration and beauty, and as the single root in him of all his energies, intellect and will, imagination, emotion, passions, instincts, and obscure tendencies. The question is, as Léon Bloy put it, not to hit below the heart. Art and poetry awaken the dreams of man and his longings and reveal to him some of the abysses he has in himself. The artist is not ignorant of that. How will he deal with this problem? I have said in our previous talk that beauty is an absolute which admits of no division, and that the artist is bound to serve this absolute. He is first responsible to his work. Now, must he bend or bow his work and his art in order that men should not chance to be led astray by them? If the artist asks himself the question, not by fear of the public, but by virtue of a genuine sense of his responsibility, it is because he loves the truth and thinks of his fellow men with generosity. It is finally because he loves them. This means that he already has the answer. At this point, I should like to appropriate with a view to an issue which Rimbaud did not have in mind, the famous saying of Rimbaud, La charité est cette clé. Charity is the key. For it is inside the soul of the poet, in those very depths of the creativity of the spirit, where all the substance of man and all his longings and all his energies, emotional and intellectual, poetic and moral, are concentrated, that the conflict demands to be solved. In the first place, but this is not the primary consideration, love makes those whom we love present within ourselves, as a part, so to speak, of our own subjectivity. What is a beautiful work, on the other hand, if not a work that we love? When we cannot love a poem or a painting, it ceases to be beautiful for us, even if it is perfectly made. Suppose that you read a magnificent poem in which your mother is insulted and vilified. This poem cannot be beautiful for you. What remains of it for you is only a well-contrived artifact, but incapable of delighting the sight. Thus it is that literary criticism cannot, even from the sole point of view of beauty, rule out any consideration of the moral or ideological content of works. Similarly, if the artist loves truth and loves his fellow men, anything in the world which might distort the truth or deteriorate the human soul will displease him and lose for him that delight with which beauty affords. Respect for truth and for the human souls will become an objective condition or requirement affecting his virtue of art itself, just as a rule of prosody was for the classical poet, or as the necessity of having stairs and windows in a house is for architecture, or as the necessity of making an image before which it is possible to pray is for sacred art. Such kinds of obstacles, if they are obstacles, have never obliged an artist to bend or bow his art. They oblige him to make his art more straight and more powerful. Yet this aspect of the question remains secondary and accidental, as it were. What matters most and is essential is the fact that love, I don't mean any kind of love, I mean love of charity, when it takes hold of man, makes the entire subjectivity pure, and consequently the creative source also pure. As François Mauriac put it, to purify the source, this is the only way. The reason for this is clear enough. While expressing and manifesting some inside aspect or secret of things in his work, what the artist expresses and manifests first and foremost in this work is his own self, his own subjectivity, through the instrumentality of his virtue of art. As a result, any kind of distorted inclination or secret connivance with evil in himself will inevitably reflect on his work, one way or another. And the work, whatever things perhaps horrible or shameful it may describe, can be free from any inclination to or connivance with moral evil, only if the source is a purified self. A purified source is not, as Julian Green or Graham Greene would sometimes seem to think, a source timid or prudent or with an admixture of chemicals. A purified source springs from the depths of man's substance and is as wild and irrepressible as any other, but it has no mud. This is the work of self-discipline and the cultivation of moral virtues, but first of all of transforming love. Then the artist is no longer in need to think of the souls of his fellow men. He can forget them, forget men and everything. He can do as he pleases. He is sure that his work will lead nobody astray. The sentence of Mauriac, which I just quoted, is taken from a book, Dieu et Mammon, in which he struggles with Gide and insists that a Christian novelist is not a contradiction in terms. Gide insisted, on the other hand, that the devil contributes to any work of art. I am ready to grant that this is true to one extent or another, as long as the source is not purified. For art, taken in itself, as we have seen, makes fun of everything save the glory of the work, and the devil makes mud in the source a fine ingredient for this glory. But when there is no mud, the devil loses his bite. And the art of a purified soul uses anything, even mud, for the glory of the work, but with pure hands and with no connivance. Here again, the sole problem which always remains for the artist is not to be weak in his own God-given commission, to be in possession of an art strong and straight enough to be always master of everything it brings into play, without losing anything of its creative purity, and to be intent in his very operation on the good of the work alone, without being deflected or disturbed by the weight of the human or divine riches which fill his heart. I have also said in the preceding lecture that the artistic conscience of the poet forbids him to change anything in the work which is required by the good of the work as he sees it, and by his inner singular truth as a poet. And I have added that the moral conscience of the poet is also involved in the very fact, for it is always bad to act against one's own conscience. Now, what happens if, on the other hand, and this time from the point of view of the human good, the moral conscience of the artist, if he has any, declares that something in the work, as artistically good and necessary as he may see it, is morally bad, and that therefore it must be changed. Where is the solution? Posed in these terms, the problem, I think, has no solution. As long as his artistic conscience commands him to do his work in this way, the conscience of the artist is divided against itself. He is in a state of insoluble perplexity. If he does not change his work, he will offend the moral law, and he will be wrong. If he changes his work, he will betray his conscience in another way, and also be wrong. As a matter of fact, it is possible that the moral evil ascribed to a work is only apparent. Then there is no problem. It is also possible and probable that the moral conscience of an artist whose work is really pernicious is contaminated by questionable human inclinations, warped instincts, or resentments or vices, which he shelters behind his heart. Then he will claim, and perhaps sincerely believe, that his work is innocent and incapable of offending morality, and is even the greatest tribute ever paid to virtue. But this is not a solution. It is a fake or an escape. There is a solution, indeed, but more difficult than people would want. The only solution for such an artist is to change not his work while remaining what he is, but to change himself. Then it is his artistic conscience itself which will require from him another kind of work. The prudent man if he has to intervene, does not trouble himself with these spiritual entanglements. He will brandish the moral law against this artist and summon him to change his work, whatever his inner state of mind and his artistic conscience may be. The wise man, I think, will not do so. He knows that the social community has its legislators, its magistrates, his legions of decency, his women's clubs, its postmaster general, to defend itself against pernicious or even supposedly pernicious works of art. With regard to the artist himself in question, he will try to induce him to purify the soul, to change himself. There is no other real solution. In the last minutes I have at my disposal, I would like to make a final remark and call our attention to a phenomenon which took place in the last century and which might be called the imperialist invasion of art in the very domain of morality, that is, in human life. I spoke at the beginning of the distinction to be made between the creative self and the self-centered ego, and of the manner in which self-awareness risks to make the artist shift from the one to the other. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romanticists were the forerunners of the event. But the school of art for art's sake gave it its full dimensions through the effect of a strange dialectics, by virtue of the principle that the artistic value only matters. Then, instead of remaining enclosed in the ivory tower of art for art's sake, the artistic value and the poetic creativity and the poetic act were to claim sovereignty over all the human life and to perform a function which spreads all over the destiny of mankind. In the Romantic period, Byron, Goethe, Hugo had made themselves heroes, greater, as Mr. Blackmore puts it, than any of the heroes in their work. Arnold, he goes on to say, was making his claims that poetry might save the world by taking on the jobs of all the other functions of the mind at the expressive level, unquote. Then came the poet Maudit, then the supreme seer whom Rimbaud glorified. And then the artist found that he had upon his hands the task of the deliberate creation of conscience in a conscienceless society. The French critic Jacques Rivière had similarly pointed out, it is only with the Romanticists that the literary act began to be conceived as a kind of assault on the absolute, and its result as a prophetic revelation. The writer, Rivière went on to say, has become a priest. All the 19th century literature is a vast incantation toward the miracle. The ivory tower has become the cathedral of the world, the temple of the Pythoness, the rock of Prometheus, and the altar of the supreme sacrifice. I submit that the very fact constitutes a refutation per absurdum of the theory of art for art's sake.